This is the brief on organ transplants and extreme longevity. Okay, so there was this hot mic conversation. You might have heard Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un caught talking about living to 150 using organ transplants. Yeah, it kind of reveals a shocking misunderstanding of biology, not to mention this seriously chilling ethical side. So let's dig into the three big things they seem to be missing here. Okay, first, living to 150. Even with unlimited resources, that's just not happening. Our bodies wear out, you know? It's not like swapping car parts. Take someone like Putin or Xi. Around 72, honestly, based on current data, they've got maybe a 1 in 4 shot of making it past 90. So 150, pretty much impossible, scientifically. Right, second, even if you could keep swapping organs, think about the big killers. Alzheimer's, stroke, heart disease. These are system-wide problems, you know? A new kidney won't fix your brain or your whole circulation. Plus, and this is huge, you need anti-rejection drugs for life. And those drugs, they hammer your immune system, opening you up to deadly infections. Kinda defeats the purpose, right? And finally, look, we have to talk about where these organs would even come from. It's pretty grim. For an organ to work, it needs oxygenated blood. That means it has to be taken out incredibly quickly, often raising the terrifying idea of taking them from living people. And get this, sometimes muscle relaxants are used. That stops the person from moving, sure, but it doesn't stop them from being aware. Imagine being paralyzed but conscious while, well, you get the picture. It's horrific. So yeah, joking or serious, this whole transplants for immortality idea, it's just a really dangerous misunderstanding of basic human biology.
Welcome to the debate. Our focus today, well, it centers on some rather unsettling material concerning certain world leaders, specifically Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un. They were apparently discussing organ transplants, perhaps, aspirationally, as a way to achieve extreme longevity, targeting something like 150 years.
And the source material presents us with a real dilemma, doesn't it? On one hand, you have medical experts basically dismissing this 150-year goal as, quote, completely wrong. They point to basic biology, statistics. But then on the other hand, the mere discussion raises these, well, the text calls them horrendous implications tied to how you'd actually get the organs, specifically sourcing them from living, maybe even conscious donors.
Exactly. So the question we really need to tackle is this. Is the real issue here the scientific, let's say, implausibility of them actually living to 150, or is it the ethical nightmare, the logistics, the moral hazard involved in getting the organs needed for that kind of ambition, even if it fails? I'll be arguing that it's the ethical mechanisms, the sourcing, that pose the immediate and, frankly, the more critical crisis.
And I'll be taking a slightly different tack. While I absolutely agree those ethical concerns are, well, terrifying, I'm going to argue that the biological and statistical facts, the very things that make 150 years basically impossible, they actually act as a fundamental limit on how big and how real that ethical threat can become. I mean, if the whole medical idea is doomed from the start, doesn't that undermine the drive for such a horrific acquisition system?
Well, my core argument really is that the truly frightening part of that conversation lies in the operational structure needed for viable organ acquisition. And this is dictated by biology. It doesn't really matter how old the patient eventually gets. The material is quite clear. For a major organ transplant to work, the organ itself can't degrade. That happens, within minutes after blood stops circulating? So the removal, it has to happen while the heart is still beating, while the blood's still oxygenated. Now, to do that surgically, you almost always need muscle relaxants. These drugs, they paralyze the patient, stop the moving, obviously, but, and this is the crucial point, they often leave the donor fully conscious. This creates what the material hints at, this systemic crisis of consciousness, operating on living people who are aware but just physically cannot signal their distress. The material is quite clear.
So this whole architecture for illicit acquisition, identifying people beforehand, tissue typing them, using prisoners perhaps, people who aren't brain dead, that is the profound ethical crisis we have to look at. It's an immediate human rights of use. We even have tragically historical precedents like those mentioned from World War II Japan. The preparation for this kind of sourcing That's the current danger, whether or not the recipient makes it to 90, let alone 150.
Okay, that is a powerful and, yes, chilling way to frame it, but I think we have to ground this ambition in, well, reality. This idea of hitting 150 through transplants, it seems based on a pretty deep biological misunderstanding. It's really just a completely false hope, isn't it? Simply replacing peripheral organs isn't going to stop death indefinitely. We run up against a biological ceiling, and crucially, one that transplants can't fix. We need to look at the actual data. Medical history, it's pretty stark. Only one person, Jean Calmette, is documented as living past 120. And if we look at the reality for, say, powerful leaders today, even a very well-cared-for 72-year-old, according to U.S. data from 2022, has roughly a 23-24% chance of dying in the next 10 years. The probability of even reaching 92 is only about 26%. Organ transplants, they just don't override that basic statistical fate. And why? Because they don't address the main reasons people die at advanced ages. I mean, look at the leading causes. Dementia, Alzheimer's disease. You can't obviously transplant a brain. And yes, you might replace a heart, but most heart disease later in life isn't just a faulty pump. It's systemic arteriopathy, problems throughout the circulatory system. Transplants are really quite specific tools for specific organ failures. They're almost useless against the broader processes of aging, especially systemic issues and, critically, non-transplantable neurological decline. So the organs they might be seeking, however horrifically obtained, are actually functionally flawed tools for reaching that specific goal of 150.
I absolutely see why you're emphasizing that functional lifespan ceiling. And I agree, the 150-year goal itself is, well, scientifically ludicrous. The fact that dementia and Alzheimer's are leading causes and we have no transplant solution for the brain, yes, that renders that specific ambition pretty much null and void. However, I suppose I'd argue that the ultimate futility of reaching 150 doesn't cancel out the need for the organ now in their minds, nor does it negate the documented hints of illicit sourcing methods like the confirmed tissue typing of prisoners mentioned. That ethical architecture, the system involving muscle relaxants and the potential for consciousness during removal, that's the active mechanism that allows this horror. Focusing only on the statistics showing 150 is impossible. It kind of gives us an intellectual out, doesn't it? It lets us treat the threat as maybe hypothetical or far-fetched. But the evidence, or at least the implications in the material, suggests the cruelty of the method the immediate human rights violation is potentially active right now. It doesn't really matter if the recipient lives to 85 or dies trying to reach 150. The conversation shifts, for me, from a debate about future science possibilities to a documented moral failure happening in the present.
Right. I see the point about the immediacy of the moral failure, but I suppose I worry we're disconnecting the demand from the actual utility. Aren't those two things fundamentally linked? I mean, the sheer scale of the ethical threat you're outlining, this continuous widespread use of conscious donors, surely that depends on the belief that these transplants actually deliver radical life extension. The conversation suggests these leaders do see transplants as some kind of panacea against aging. Now, if we clearly establish the medical reality that these replacement organs offer, at best, marginal temporary gains, and they completely fail to tackle systemic aging or neurological decline, doesn't that change the risk calculation for anyone implementing such a strategy?
Why would you risk international outcry, incredibly complex logistics, moral condemnation, all for an intervention that might only buy a few extra years, or, even worse, might increase the risk of dying from something else? I find it hard to believe the immediate ethical threat remains quite as critical if the medical procedure itself is proven to be so functionally limited for that stated goal.
That's a compelling line of reasoning, the link between utility and demand. But let's think about the nature of, extreme power versus cold, hard practicality. The conversation, it implies a perceived access to almost limitless resources, doesn't it? Almost regardless of the actual scientific viability. So maybe we shouldn't focus only on that 150-year fantasy. Yes, the dream is unrealistic, but the ability or the perceived ability of these high-level leaders to get any transplant, one that just buys them a few more functional years, that still seems to hinge entirely on that horrifying acquisition method, removal while the heart is still beating. The exchange feels less about what medical science can actually do
and more about the perceived right of these individuals to use any means necessary, however awful, to fight their own biological decline. The moral horror is baked into the method itself, which the source material suggests is prepared for, even documented, not just in the highly theoretical and likely impossible final result.
But okay, that leads us straight into the second major limitation, which I think really undercuts the value of setting up this whole acquisition architecture in the first place. The actual efficacy and practicality of doing major transplants on the elderly. We can't ignore the physical realities that are actually cited in the source material itself. Old people aren't fit for transplants. Let's be specific here. Major surgery, especially replacing a vital organ, becomes incredibly dangerous as people get older. This isn't like getting a quick tune-up. It's a massive physiological stress. And furthermore, any major organ transplant necessitates taking anti-rejection drugs, immunosuppressants for the rest of the recipient's life. And what do these drugs do? They systematically weaken, even cripple the recipient's immune system. So this creates a huge systemic burden. It makes the patient far more vulnerable to other common causes of death in later life. Things like infections, influenza, pneumonia. The goal is longevity, right? But the treatment itself introduces this massive new vulnerability. You're essentially trading the problem of a failing organ for the problem of a severely weakened immune system. So for a leader hoping to live to 150 or frankly even just to 90, the net gain in actual functional healthy years might be negligible. It could even be zero or negative. This inherent systemic frailty, it really weakens the argument for needing such a high-risk, morally abhorrent acquisition scheme.
I do appreciate the depth of that point about immunological compromise. It's a strong one. If the net gain really is zero or negative, then yes, logically, why bother with the cruelty? But I'm just not entirely convinced that these figures, these leaders, are operating based on a strict, rational, scientific cost-benefit analysis. Their desire might not just be about calculated longevity. It could be about, perceived access to exclusive, cutting-edge medical tech, almost as a status symbol, or simply a refusal to accept limits. And dismissing the 150-year goal is just pretentious fantasy, as the source sort of implies. I worry that creates a space where we ignore the more immediate, documented threat, the knowledge that organs are potentially being taken from living donors. That suggests an active, present human rights issue, the reality of operating on potentially conscious people.
The debate about whether they ultimately reach 92 or 150 feels, abstract and academic compared to the truly chilling implication of what must be ready to happen right now to get a viable organ for even a short-term gain. The ethical crisis feels substantive, documented, and present.
But I'd argue that rigorously debunking the fantasy is crucial precisely because that hope, that fantasy of extreme longevity, is what would fuel the demand for scaling up these unethical practices. If these leaders genuinely truly believe that just swapping out organs can lead to indefinite life, then the pressure to maintain and even expand that illicit sourcing system becomes immense, almost unstoppable. We have to use the medical reality to counter that dangerous ambition. By establishing very clearly that the biological endpoint is still going to be premature death because of non-transplantable diseases, because of the surgical risks, because of the weakened immunity, then the perceived value that drives this horrific acquisition demand gets drastically reduced. Understanding the scientific limits actually strengthens the argument against the viability of maintaining such large-scale, ethically nightmarish systems.
The less the medical payoff, surely the weaker the incentive becomes over time.
So the distinction really comes down to this, doesn't it? Do we prioritize dismantling the delusion that fuels the potential future demand, or do we prioritize addressing the horrifying apparatus that seems already established to meet the current, even if marginal, demand? My concern, it remains fixed on the fact that the mechanism for this kind of acquisition appears operational or at least prepared. The truly chilling part of that conversation is the hint at a system ready to bypass normal criteria for death, ready to take organs while circulation is intact. That, to me, confirms a substantive, active, ethical crisis right now.
And I suppose I keep coming back to the fact that the medical data provides that essential context we need to really assess the true gravity and scale of that threat. It tells us that the leader's underlying assumption, this simplistic idea that organ replacement equals indefinite youth, is just fundamentally wrong. The inability to fix systemic diseases like dementia, plus the huge problems caused by lifelong immunosuppression, it means transplants are actually a very limited, very risky tool for longevity, even if you could get the organs through the most terrible means imaginable.
Ultimately, you're right. The source material really pushes us to confront these two distinct but deeply intertwined issues. On one side, you have the hard limits of human biology, which pretty much dictates we don't live to 150. And on the other, you have the, terrifying flexibility of human ethics, showing what powerful people might attempt when faced with their own mortality and a desperate desire for more life. The conversation seems to reveal both a profound scientific delusion and simultaneously an active, present moral hazard.
Indeed. And that tension between, biological fate and ethical choice, it clearly remains open for more exploration. We've established, I think, that these individuals are likely fundamentally mistaken in their hopes of reaching 150. But the methods they might apparently contemplate using, even just to grasp at a few extra years, that raises moral questions whose horror really does transcend the scientific debate.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a source here that is, frankly, astonishing and deeply unnerving, too. It centers around this casual conversation, seemingly casual, a piece of dialogue picked up on hot microphones.
Right. Between three, let's say, very significant world leaders.
Exactly. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un. Powerful, maybe unpredictable figures.
It absolutely sounds like, the setup for a really bad geopolitical joke, doesn't it?
It does. But the subject matter reported was, anything but funny.
Not at all. The conversation, as has been reported, allegedly revolved around the possibility of repeated organ transplants.
Repeated transplant. And this shared, pretty ambitious goal of living to, 150 years old?
150, yes. That was the number floated.
Right. So our mission in this deep dive, for you listening, is really to guide you through this strange intersection. It's like geopolitical fantasy meeting hard biology. We're taking this exchange, which, seems maybe jocular on the surface, and we're going to rigorously test it against medical data, against historical records on longevity, and really importantly, against surgical reality.
Yeah, the practicalities.
Exactly. We need to figure out two things for you. First, how realistic is this 150-year lifespan goal? I mean, even if you had unfettered access to the world's best medicine.
Is it even remotely possible?
That's the question. And second, what deeply concerning real-world implications does this touch upon, specifically regarding, where these organs might come from?
The sourcing, yes.
Because the stakes here, they go far beyond just some personal fantasy of living forever.
Absolutely. And the discussion itself, it's kind of framed by the ages of the people involved.
Right. Tell us about that.
Well, you've got Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Both are currently around 72 years old.
Okay.
And then there's Kim Jong-un, significantly younger, probably 41, maybe 42.
And there's some superficial observations noted, too.
Yes. The source mentions his, let's say, somewhat overweight physical status, just an observation included in the report.
What immediately stands out, though, and you touched on this, is the temperament of these individuals.
Yes. Not exactly known for being comedians.
No. They aren't known for their easygoing demeanor, are they? Not the type you'd, have a laugh with down the pub, as they say.
Definitely not. Their public personas are, rigid, cautious, focused entirely on power projection.
So the fact that they were reportedly having this exchange about organs and living to 150, it raises an immediate and frankly chilling question.
Which is?
Was this genuinely a joke they were sharing? Maybe some kind of dark fantasy? A bit of gallows humor?
Or the alternative?
Or were they seriously discussing what they perhaps consider a viable, maybe secret possibility? A way to maintain the health of, the global elite themselves?
And that distinction, joke versus serious intent, it's crucial, isn't it?
Why is it so crucial?
Because if they genuinely believe in this prospect, reaching 150 through repeated organ swapping, well, think about what that implies.
On an infrastructure.
A massive infrastructure. A huge logistical supply chain would be needed to support that kind of goal.
And that infrastructure.
It flies in the face of, all existing medical ethics, basic human rights even. It's a terrifying thought if taken seriously.
Okay, so let's start with the fantasy itself then. This core belief, this idea that you can defeat aging just by replacing worn-out parts, like a car.
Right. And the specifics of the translated exchange, they give us a glimpse into that mindset.
What did they actually say, according to the report?
Well, Xi Jinping, who, as we said, is 72, reportedly made this rather self-serving observation.
No.
He apparently said that, historically, living past 70 was rare. But today, he said something like, 70's one is still a child. Or a spring chicken, perhaps.
Well, convenient, given his age.
Very convenient. It's clearly an attempt to sort of normalize their current age, isn't it? To frame it as a starting point for more longevity, not the beginning of the end, biologically speaking.
It sets the stage then for the, well, pseudoscientific claim that apparently followed.
Exactly. The conversation, reportedly translated from Mandarin, involved this claim. It's attributed possibly to Kim Jong-un, maybe Putin.
What was the claim?
That human organs can be repeatedly transplanted, and that this process allows one to get younger and younger in spite of age.
Younger and younger. Just swap out an organ.
That's the idea presented, and that is where the discussion immediately, collides violently with biological reality.
How so? Explain the flaw there.
The misconception is profound. It's just deeply flawed science or maybe wishful thinking. This idea that swapping out a single feeling organ, say a kidney or a heart, can somehow reset your body's entire aging clock.
It sounds too simple.
It's completely wrong. I mean, think about it. While that specific transplanted organ might be biologically younger than the person receiving it.
Right, if it came from a younger donor.
Yes. But the rest of your body, your brain, your muscles, your skin, your blood vessels, the rest of you is still old.
So if we look closer at aging itself.
Yeah.
It isn't just one component failing at a time, is it? Like a light bulb burning out.
Precisely. That's the key. Aging isn't like that. It's systemic. It's driven by these interconnected factors that scientists call the hallmarks of aging.
Hallmarks of aging, like what?
Well, think of things like cellular senescence. That's where cells stop dividing, but they don't die. They hang around like zombies, basically, releasing inflammatory compounds that damage surrounding tissues.
Okay, zombie cells.
Then there's mitochondrial dysfunction. The mitochondria are the power plants of your cells, right?
Mm-hmm.
They degrade over time, become less efficient.
Right, less energy.
And critically, there's telomere shortening.
Oh.
Telomeres are the protective caps on the ends of your chromosomes. Every time a cell divides, they get a tiny bit shorter.
Like the plastic tips on shoelaces.
Sort of, yeah. And eventually they get too short and the cell can't divide safely anymore. A new heart does absolutely nothing zero to reverse the shortening of the telomeres in your brain cells.
Or your skin cells, or the lining of your blood vessels.
Exactly. Your vascular endothelium. The entire rest of your aging body is still marching relentlessly towards, entropy, towards breakdown.
And yet, despite this biological certainty, Xi Jinping reportedly concluded the chat by setting this ultimate goal.
Yes, the explicit prediction. In this century, it might become possible to live to 150.
150. Based on organ swaps.
And that statement, look, from a scientific standpoint, it's pure fiction. We have to emphatically, strongly disagree with it.
There's no basis for it.
There's no biological precedent. There's no plausible mechanism known to science that could extend human lifespan to 150 years. I mean, even with the absolute best, most expensive, most personalized medical care imaginable, their biological destiny is still set within relatively predictable limits.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for you listening, because we can stop talking hypotheticals now. We can run a hard statistical reality check on their claim.
Let's look at the data.
Let's look at the data for men age 72. That applies directly to Putin and Xi Jinping. We can use robust U.S. actuarial data from 2022. That gives us a solid probability baseline.
And even if we assume, that their access to medical care is vastly superior to the average person.
Which it undoubtedly is.
Right. But their bodies are still subject to the fundamental laws of biology. The compounding risk of mortality, which increases year by year, inescapably.
So let's delve into those actuarial tables. What do they tell us?
Okay. For a 72-year-old man, the chance of living just one more decade, just to age 82, is 76.6%.
Okay, 76.6%. That sounds reasonably high. 3 out of 4, roughly.
It sounds high, but look at the flip side, the other side of that coin.
Which is?
There's a 23.4% chance of death in the next 10 years.
Almost 1 in 4.
Basically a 1 in 4 chance. We're talking about world leaders, men with, power beyond measure. But biologically, they face almost a 1 in 4 chance of being dead in the next decade. just based on statistics for their age group.
Wow. And as we extend that timeline out further, does it hold up?
No, it collapses dramatically. And this really illustrates the brutal reality of aging.
Okay, give us the next number.
If we stretch that timeline out another decade to age 92, so 20 years from now for them,
Right.
the chance of these 72-year-old men reaching their 92nd birthday drops to only 26%.
26%. So less than 1 in 4 make it to 92?
At 26%, that's the shocking number, really. It means there's a 74% chance, nearly 3 out of 4, that they will die in the next 20 years.
74% mortality risk in the next 2 decades.
It just shows that steep, inevitable climb of the mortality curve in later life. You know, their power, their wealth, it cannot negotiate with the mathematics of biological attrition. It just can't.
But wait, they weren't targeting 82 or 92. They were talking about 150.
Exactly, which is why we need to look beyond probabilities and consider the absolute maximum.
The ceiling of human existence. How long can humans live?
We have to look at the maximum documented human lifespan. And the gold standard, the undisputed record holder, remains Jeanne Calment from France.
Jeanne Calment. How old was she?
She died back in 1997. And she was aged 122 years and 164 days.
122.
And crucially, she is the only human being whose age has been rigorously documented and verified beyond any doubt to have exceeded 120 years.
So that singularity is really key here, isn't it?
Yeah.
She is, as far as we know from reliable evidence, the only one.
Exactly. This isn't some common event that advanced medicine is just, waiting to unlock for everyone. It seems to be a biological lottery win. So incredibly rare. It's only happened once in the history of reliable record keeping.
A complete outlier.
A complete outlier. And if we look at the current oldest people alive today, the oldest woman is, I believe, 116. The oldest man around 112. Now, these people are amazing outliers too, of course, but they still reinforce this idea of a hard ceiling, maybe around 120, 125.
So longevity research isn't really aiming for 150.
No, not realistically. Research talks about something called the compression of morbidity. That means maybe we can squeeze most illness and disability into the very last few years of life, so you live healthier for longer.
Okay, a longer health span.
Exactly. But extending the actual maximum lifespan much beyond 125, well, that seems to hit some kind of species-level biological barrier.
Okay. So if we synthesize this first section then, the conclusion on longevity seems unavoidable. Absolute, really.
It is. The probability of these individuals, Putin, Xi, Kim, reaching 150, even with unlimited resources, even with the most aggressive hypothetical transplant regimen.
A probability is?
Zero. It's effectively zero. Their individual biological trajectories, despite their status, will closely follow the general pattern of human mortality, meaning their risk of death is compounding dramatically every single year from now on.
Which brings us neatly to the core technical failure of their idea. This belief that organ transplants are some kind of magic bullet for systemic old age.
Yes, exactly. That's the crux of the next part, why this strategy is fundamentally flawed.
Right, that's our transition into section 2. Why organ replacement just cannot solve the core problem of systemic aging. Where do we start with that?
Well, the first paradox is purely medical, and it's something that people often overlook.
Okay.
Older people, generally speaking, are not considered medically fit for transplants.
Why not, if they have access to the best care?
Because a major organ transplant, think a heart, a liver, a lung, it's one of the most stressful, most invasive procedures a human body can possibly undergo.
Huge physiological stress.
Immense. A 72-year-old who likely already has some underlying conditions, maybe some vascular disease, maybe compromised lung function, they are often a terrible candidate for such a massive surgery. The risks are just too high.
And even if they somehow survive the operation itself, there's more, isn't there? There's the aftermath.
Oh, absolutely. The necessity of post-operative care introduces lifelong risks, and these risks actively counteract the intended longevity gain. It's not a simple fix.
What kind of lifelong care are we talking?
Right. Any major organ transplant requires the patient to take potent anti-rejection drugs, immunosuppressants.
For how long?
For the rest of their life.
The rest of their life. Why?
Because your immune system is designed to recognize foreign tissue, that new organ. It's foreign. Your T cells, those specialized white blood cells, will see it as an invader and attack it, leading to rejection.
So the drugs suppress that attack.
Exactly. They suppress the T cells. But you see the problem. You don't just get a new heart and walk off into the sunset feeling young again.
It's not that simple. What are the primary lifelong risks associated with suppressing your immune system like that? Because that feels like a critical detail these leaders might be conveniently ignoring.
The risks are significant, and they absolutely run counter to the goal of living to 150. First, and most obviously, by lowering the efficiency of your immune system.
You get sick more easily.
Highly susceptible to opportunistic infections, things that a healthy immune system would brush off. The simplest hold could potentially turn into life-threatening pneumonia.
And we know pneumonia is already a major killer in older populations.
Precisely. That's risk number one. Risk number two. Immunosuppression significantly increases the risk of certain types of cancers.
Cancers? How?
Specifically lymphomas, like a condition called post-transplant lymphoproliferative disorder, or PTLD. The immune system normally keeps cancerous cells in check. Dampen the immune system for decades, and that risk goes way up.
So the very drugs needed to keep the new organ functioning.
Actively increase your risk of dying from infections and cancer. Two of the major causes of death in any elderly population anyway.
Wow. That completely reframes the entire discussion, doesn't it? A new organ doesn't just buy you health.
No, it buys you a complex, high-risk, chronic disease management regimen for the rest of your potentially shortened life.
Okay, so to really hammer home why their transplant fantasy fails, we need to look at what actually kills people in their age bracket, the leading causes of death.
Yes. Let's analyze the U.S. 2022 leading causes of death data and see how transplant viability stacks up against them.
Where do we begin? What's the top killer?
We have to start with the leading cause of death in the United States, particularly relevant to this older age group, dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
Okay. Devastating neurological diseases.
Yeah.
For these conditions, what is the transplant effectiveness?
Zero.
Zero.
The absolute zero. And that is absolute. You cannot have a brain transplant. It's just not possible.
Right.
Dementia, Alzheimer's. These are fundamentally driven by the deterioration of the central nervous system. You get accumulation of misfolded proteins like amyloid plaques and tau tangles. There's chronic inflammation in the brain, general decline of blood flow to the brain.
It's a brain failure, essentially.
It's a brain failure. And as you hinted at earlier, the body is an ecosystem. If you change a heart or a liver, maybe you allow the person to survive physically long enough.
To inevitably develop these devastating neurological conditions anyway.
Exactly. So organ replacement is completely futile against the failure of the mind. It offers no solution whatsoever.
It's like putting premium fuel and new tires on a car where the entire computer system, the ECU, is failing.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've addressed one part of the system, maybe, but the core command center is still breaking down irrecoverably.
Okay, so that's the biggest killer. Off the table. What's next?
Let's move to the second leading cause, ischemic heart disease. This accounts for about 10.3% of deaths in the U.S.
Ischemic heart disease. Okay, this is where people might think, heart transplant.
Right. That's the common assumption. But the viability, the usefulness of a transplant here is actually extremely limited.
Why? Why is a 72-year-old with severe heart disease likely a poor candidate for a new heart?
The key word, again, is systemic. Ischemic heart disease usually means the patient is almost certainly arteriopathic, meaning they suffer from generalized atherosclerosis. That's the hardening and narrowing of arteries throughout their entire vascular system, not just the ones feeding the heart muscle itself.
So it's not just the heart.
Rarely just the heart in someone that age. Transplant centers typically perform heart replacements on much younger patients, maybe people in their 40s or 50s who have specific isolated heart conditions, like, say, viral cardiomyopathy, where the rest of their vascular system might still be relatively healthy.
So even if the new heart itself is technically perfect,
Yeah.
the plumbing it's connected to is already compromised.
Exactly. You're putting a new, powerful pump into a plumbing system. The rest of the body's arteries that is already, rusted out, brittle, clogged with plaque.
Makes the surgery riskier.
Much riskier. Recovery is more difficult. And critically, the underlying high-risk factors, high blood pressure, cholesterol, maybe diabetes, the things that killed the first heart are still present and are immediately starting to damage the new one.
So it's highly unlikely a new heart would provide the kind of massive life extension they're talking about.
Very unlikely in this context. Maybe a few extra years, potentially, but not decades leading to 150. Not even close.
Okay, let's consider the third major cause of death then. What is it?
Chronic lower respiratory disease. This accounts for about 5.2% of deaths. It often includes conditions like COPD, emphysema.
Okay, lung diseases. Can transplants help here?
Well, technically, yes. You could perform a single or even a double lung transplant.
There's always a but, it seems.
There usually is with transplants in the elderly. Patients with severe chronic respiratory disease often have multiple other serious health problems, comorbidities.
Like what?
They might be malnourished because breathing is such hard work. They might be immobile. They often have heart issues secondary to the lung damage, like pulmonary hypertension.
So they're already quite frail.
Very frail, often. And the success rate of lung transplantation is notoriously challenging anyway, even in younger, healthier patients. The recovery is brutal.
So for an elderly leader whose primary failure mechanism is probably the systemic deterioration we keep talking about.
Right. This complex, high-risk surgery would be highly unlikely to offer those massive longevity gains they seem to be fantasizing about. They'd likely succumb to a complication or an infection long before reaching 90, let alone a 150.
Okay. Next on the list of killers.
Cardiovascular disease and stroke. That cluster is around 5% of deaths.
Stroke. Transplant effectiveness.
Again, zero. Absolutely zero.
Why zero again?
Because a stroke is a vascular event affecting the brain. It's either a blockage cutting off blood supply, an ischemic stroke, or bleeding within the brain, a hemorrhagic stroke.
So it's a neurological and a vascular system failure centered in the brain.
Precisely. And as we established, no brain transplant is possible. So transplants offer nothing here.
Okay. And finally, let's touch on cancers. The source mentioned malignant neoplasms of the trachea, bronchus, and lungs specifically.
Right. Cancer viability through transplant is extremely limited. It really depends entirely on the specific type of cancer and, crucially, the stage at which it's discovered. Well, hypothetically, if a specific, very localized cancer is discovered incredibly early, let's say a small sarcoma confined entirely within the liver,
Right.
then perhaps a liver transplant might remove the cancerous organ entirely before it spreads. It's theoretically possible in rare cases.
But for the leading killers, like lung cancer.
The prognosis is often poor by the time lung cancer is discovered. Why? Because cancer cells, especially from the lungs, can travel very quickly through the bloodstream or the lymphatic system.
Metastasis.
Metastasis. Once the cancer has metastasized, meaning it has disseminated, it has spread to other organs, maybe the lymph nodes, the bones, the brain. The disease is systemic. It's no longer confined to one organ.
And at that point, transplant is useless.
Completely useless. You cannot perform a multi-organ transplant to remove every single microscopic cancer cell spread throughout the body. It's just not feasible. The whole point of transplantation is to treat localized organ failure, not systemic malignancies or these widespread degenerative conditions.
It really sounds like, even for other major causes of death in this age group, like severe infections, influenza, pneumonia, you wouldn't do an organ transplant for that either, would you?
Absolutely not. You treat the infection with antibiotics or antivirals. You don't perform a lung transplant on someone already critically ill with pneumonia. It's absurd.
So it seems like these individuals, despite their immense power and presumably access to the best advice, they've somehow latched onto the one medical intervention that is least likely to solve the major causes of mortality in their specific age group.
They absolutely have. It's bizarre, medically speaking. They're focused on replacing specific parts when the entire machine, the entire body is suffering from general fatigue, systemic wear and tear, and multiple potential points of failure.
It's like trying to fix a crumbling building by replacing one brick.
Exactly. Look at other common age-related causes of death. Parkinson's disease. That's a brain issue. Transplant offers no benefit. Generalized high blood pressure disease. A new liver isn't going to fix that systemic vascular problem. Widespread vascular disease across the whole body. You'd need a whole new vascular system, not just a new heart.
So if they really wanted to pursue genuine longevity based on current science, they are completely looking in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
What is cutting-edge longevity science actually focused on today, if not just swapping organs?
That's a great question. The real science of anti-aging, the serious research, is focused on the cellular and molecular level. It's targeting those hallmarks of aging we discussed earlier.
The zombie cells and telomeres.
Yes. Researchers aren't spending billions trying to figure out how to swap out 72-year-old hearts more efficiently. They're focused on things like senolytics.
Senolytics.
Drugs designed to selectively find and kill those senescent zombie cells that accumulate and cause inflammation and damage as we age.
Okay. What else?
They're looking at ways to reprogram cellular function, perhaps make old cells behave more like young cells. There's gene therapy being explored. And yes, trying to find ways to protect and maybe even elongate telomeres, though that's complex and potentially risky.
So the leader's apparent strategy Get a new kidney, get younger. Sounds almost medieval in comparison.
It's like, yeah, maybe like a medieval physician trying to cure tuberculosis with leeches while we have modern antibiotics sitting right there on the shelf. It's fundamentally outdated thinking. It's irrelevant to actual 21st century longevity science.
Simplistic.
Simplistic and, frankly, as we said, a completely false hope based on how aging actually works. However, we should be fair. There are a few exceptions where transplants are highly effective, and we should acknowledge those.
Okay. Where can transplantation genuinely offer significant life extension or quality of life improvement?
Primarily for solid organs that fail due to a specific localized disease process rather than just systemic aging. Kidney disease is the big one. End-stage renal failure. A kidney transplant can dramatically improve life quality and longevity, completely replacing the need for dialysis.
Right. Life-saving for many.
Absolutely. Similarly, chronic liver disease or cirrhosis, perhaps caused by hepatitis or alcohol damage, a new liver can effectively treat end-stage liver failure in the right candidate.
Okay. Kidneys, liver, anything else?
Well, even in diabetes, there is ongoing research into pancreatic transplants, or maybe just transplanting the insulin-producing beta cells, but that's still quite experimental and certainly not a viable mass strategy for achieving 150 years.
So these are treatments for specific isolated organ failures, usually in people who are otherwise relatively healthy, not a solution for old age itself in septuagenarians.
Precisely. They are not designed to combat the overall aging process that affects every cell in the body.
Okay. So we've really nailed the numbers now. 150 is pure fantasy. We've shown why swapping organs fundamentally fails as an anti-aging strategy because it ignores the main killers like neurological decline and widespread vascular decay. Now, we have to transition to the most unsettling part of this entire deep dive.
Yes, a darker implication.
If these leaders are discussing repeated organ transplants, whether they're serious or joking, it immediately raises the horrifying real-world question of where these theoretical organs would actually come from.
This is where we, unfortunately, leave the relatively safe realm of scientific debunking and statistics, and we enter the realm of surgical necessity and, frankly, ethical horror.
Okay.
The biological imperative here, the constraint imposed by nature, is chillingly strict, and it's absolute.
Explain that chilling necessity. What's the biological constraint they'd be working under if they pursued this?
Okay. If the blood circulation stops, if oxygen delivery to the organs ceases, those organs begin to die almost immediately.
Because of lack of oxygen.
Exactly. It's called ischemia. Kidneys, the liver, and especially the heart deteriorate incredibly rapidly once blood flow stops.
Out rapidly.
For a viable heart transplant, the donor usually needs to be declared brain dead, but their heart kept beating artificially. And then the organ must be removed extremely quickly, ideally within minutes, maybe 4 to 5 minutes maximum after circulatory support might theoretically stop.
4 to 5 minutes for a heart. What about other organs?
For a kidney or a liver, you have a slightly longer window, maybe 20 to 30 minutes after circulation ceases before the damage is irreversible. But even then, the quality of the organ degrades exponentially the longer it goes without oxygenated blood.
So, the frightening conclusion seems unavoidable then.
Okay.
If you want high-quality, truly viable organs for transplantation, the kind these powerful individuals would undoubtedly demand.
Yes.
They must be removed while the blood is still circulating, while it's still being oxygenated, and critically, while the heart is still beating.
That is the stark biological reality.
Which leads directly, inexorably, to the abhorrent prospect, the idea of organs being removed from living people, people who haven't consented.
Yes. And the surgical reality required to perform such a procedure, it demands not only very, very skilled surgeons, obviously,
Right.
but absolute control over the donor's body by anesthetists, complete physiological control.
And what happens physiologically when a surgeon, say, opens a major body cavity like the chest or abdomen? Why does that require such intense control, even if the person is supposedly unconscious?
Because opening body cavities, cutting through deep tissue, it's a massive shock to the nervous system. Even in a patient who is deeply unconscious under general anesthesia, this kind of stimulus triggers powerful spinal reflexes.
Reflexes, like what?
The body naturally resists. Muscles tense up violently, the patient might jerk or try to move reflexively, which makes delicate surgery impossible and dangerous.
So how do surgeons prevent that?
To prevent these reflexes, patients undergoing major surgery must be administered powerful muscle relaxants, neuromuscular blocking agents, drugs that completely paralyze every voluntary muscle in the entire body.
Okay, complete paralysis. And this is the crucial, terrifying detail. The one that takes us from just surgical fact to potential ethical nightmare.
Yes, this is the core of the horror. The paralyzing drugs, the muscle relaxant, they do exactly what their name says. They stop all muscle movement. Breathing stops, movement stops. But, and this is critical, unless these paralyzing drugs are accompanied by a sufficient dose of general anesthetic drugs to render the person completely unconscious, which is an entirely separate class of drug and needs careful monitoring, then the patient can still be fully conscious, aware.
Wait, you're saying you could have a situation where a potential donor is completely locked in their own body?
Yes.
Unable to breathe on their own, unable to scream, unable to move even a finger.
Yes.
But potentially fully aware.
Yes.
Aware of the incision, the procedure, the pain.
And that is the horror of conscious paralysis, sometimes known as anesthesia awareness. And the risk of it happening is exponentially higher if the primary goal is rapid organ retrieval under non-standard, non-ethical, or frankly forced circumstances. Circumstances where pain management and ensuring unconsciousness for the donor might not be the primary focus at all.
My God. And this isn't just some theoretical horror movie plot, is it? You mentioned we have precedents, historical misuse, and maybe even contemporary evidence suggesting this kind of thing is happening or could be happening today.
Unfortunately, yes. We can point to historical atrocities where medical procedures were grossly misused, certainly, but perhaps more pertinent to the current geopolitical context and this conversation between these specific leaders are the reports and the body of evidence that has emerged over recent years from certain parts of the world.
What kind of evidence?
Evidence suggesting that political prisoners or members of persecuted minority groups held captive are being systematically tissue typed and blood typed on a large scale.
What does that process, the tissue typing, actually involve, and why is it significant?
Tissue typing is essentially mapping the individual's unique immunological markers. They're called human leukocyte antigens, or HLAs. It's done to see if their organs would be a compatible match for a potential recipient, to minimize the risk of rejection.
So creating a database of potential donors.
Exactly. Building a catalog of individuals, detailing their blood type and HLA profile. This strongly suggests that these captive individuals are being pre-selected and managed not just as prisoners, but as a potential future organ supply.
A living inventory.
A living inventory, yes. The deeply disturbing implication is that their organs could be harvested at a future date on demand for high-priority recipients, perhaps wealthy individuals or politically connected figures, and harvested under conditions that ensure maximum organ quality.
Meaning, potentially while the donor is still technically alive, heart beating, to ensure that viability we talked about.
That is the horrifying suspicion raised by this evidence.
So the very fact that these three world leaders, men who wield, let's be honest, absolute power over the lives of their citizens within their borders, are even discussing the concept of repeated organ transplants. Even if it was just in jest.
Yes.
It connects their fantasy, their 150-year ambition, directly to the reported reality of forced live organ procurement, doesn't it? Their seemingly flippant talk mirrors a very dark, potentially existing practice.
It absolutely does. At the very least, it creates a kind of demand signal, doesn't it? If powerful people genuinely believe longevity can be bought this way, then the ethical constraints that govern medicine in most of the world, things like informed consent, strict criteria for brain death, voluntary donation,
all those safeguards,
they might easily be seen as merely inconvenient obstacles to be bypassed or ignored in the pursuit of their goal.
Okay. Let's try to wrap this up then, for you, the listener. Let's synthesize everything. What are the definitive structured takeaways from this deep dive into this leaders' conversation?
Right. Let's break it down. First, the overarching scientific conclusion, the biological reality check.
Okay.
The hope of reaching 150 years old through repeated organ transplants, even for the world's most powerful and wealthy individuals, is, put simply, a simplistic and completely false hope.
No basis in science.
None. It is flatly contradicted by all available human mortality data and our understanding of fundamental biological limits on lifespan. Remember, their probability of even reaching 92 is already less than 1 in 4. 150 is pure fantasy.
Okay. Takeaway number 1. 150 is impossible this way. What's second?
Second, transplants are not a universal fix for the major diseases that cause death in older populations.
Right. They don't solve the main problems.
Exactly. They offer zero benefit for the leading killer, neurological deterioration like Alzheimer's and dementia. They also don't solve systemic issues like generalized vascular disease that affects the whole body.
Because the body ages as a whole system.
Precisely. Replacing one part while the rest of the machinery is failing is medically unsound. And let's not forget, it's inherently high risk because of the lifelong immune suppression required, which increases risks of deadly infections and cancers.
Okay. False hope doesn't fix the main causes. What's the third and perhaps most disturbing takeaway?
Third, and most chillingly, we look at the surgical reality. The biological necessity for fresh, viable organs requires them to be removed while blood is circulating and the heart is still beating.
The live donor necessity.
Yes. And that requirement inescapably brings this conversation, whether it was intended as a joke or reflected a serious ambition, into direct, uncomfortable contact with the documented threat, the reported reality of organs being forcibly taken from non-consenting living donors.
Possibly under conditions of conscious paralysis.
Possibly under those horrific conditions, yes.
So, their conversation, however brief or casual it might have seemed, potentially provides a horrifying window. A glimpse into the kind of policies that could be used, or maybe are being used, to maintain the health and longevity of a privileged elite.
At the immense, often fatal expense of the voiceless, the imprisoned, and the vulnerable. It's a deeply troubling connection.
Absolutely.
You know, if we connect this to the bigger picture, maybe the philosophical picture, it really forces us to remember the fundamental nature of humanity, something that applies regardless of status or power or wealth.
How so?
Well, my old teacher, he often quoted the words of Ecclesiastes from the Hebrew Bible. And I think they provide a really profound perspective on this kind of futile quest for unnatural longevity.
What are the words?
To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted.
A time to be born and a time to die.
Yeah.
A stark, ancient reminder that ultimately power and wealth cannot negotiate with a biological clock.
Exactly. Just like everyone else on this planet, these world leaders are fundamentally wrong if they think they can beat death indefinitely through these means. Their biological clock will follow much the same pattern as ours. It will eventually run down.
So the only real question that remains then is, when they talked about 150 years, when they joked, or maybe didn't joke, about repeated transplants,
Yes.
were they simply sharing a dark, unreachable fantasy? A bit of morbid humor between powerful men?
Or the alternative.
Or were they actually expressing a dangerous belief? A demand, even. A demand that, if acted upon, leads directly down the path to the systemic violation of basic human rights in the selfish pursuit of impossible immortality.
That's the question left hanging.
And we really encourage you, listening, to consider that question, to think about the immense ethical gulf between the abstract fantasy of personal longevity for a select few and the potential gruesome reality of the forced harvesting that might be required even to attempt to make that fantasy possible.
A sobering thought to end on.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.